Managed services is a profession. It's a professional discipline. It is not a financial trick. And if the MSP channel continues to kind of elevate profit over responsibility, I think we're going to see in the future, in the near future, a lot more failures. You're going to certainly see a lot more lawsuits, and we're already seeing a regulation. So that's already here. We don't have to wait for that. That's already come. And we're going to start to see external controls imposed on the MSPs. If you want some kind of a final bit of evidence on what I'm saying is true, look at all the control frameworks that are being passed in the just last several years, let's say last 5 years. They're not all being passed just to focus on how do we make MSPs more profitable. That's not their concern. They're assuming you're making money hand over fist and you know how to do your job well. They want to see proof that you know how to do your job well. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Charles Weaver, and today we're going to be talking about something that I have kind of witnessed over the last 10 plus years start to creep into the everyday conversation that is managed services. And I am talking about profitability. And specifically, I'm talking about margins, service margins, EBITDA, valuations, revenue per seat, peer benchmarking, scorecards, leaderboards. There's a lot of stuff that goes into profitability and financial metrics that are being measured or being encouraged. People are encouraging MSPs to monitor and track these types of metrics. And I want to ask a question that may at first blush seem heretical. Who cares? Who cares about MSP profitability? Now, I know some of you saying, whoa, Charles has lost his mind again, sent off an email. Hold on. Just bear with me. I'm not saying profitability in managed services doesn't matter. In fact, I've long been on the record, going back decades, talking about financial controls, financial benchmarks, and KPIs to run an MSP practice by. So I would say, been at the forefront of talking about and advancing the cause of financial health and well-being in managed services as a profession. So I am definitively not saying that profitability doesn't matter. What I am saying is that the MSP channel's obsession with profitability in isolation and to the exclusion of many, many other things has created a blind spot for MSPs that is getting bigger, not smaller. And that blind spot, if you want to put a name to it, is MSP maturity. MSP maturity defined as things like internal security, operational discipline, cyber hygiene, professional standards, all of that I would call and classify part of MSP maturity. And it is that focus, in my opinion, that is paramount, of critical importance for today's MSP, almost to the point where it is more important to be focused on those types of issues than it is on the profitability side. And as we will see shortly, you can do one and it causes the other to happen. But there is the flip side, which is you could do one of those things and it has nothing to do with the other. We'll figure out, you could probably already guess which one I'm talking about. Let's dive in. So first, profitability as the end goal, as the end objective, not the result of best practices and changes, behavioral changes in your MSP practice. At some point in the not so distant past, maybe let's say the last 10 years, profitability for MSPs stopped being a result that occurred because of other things that you were doing in the company, and it started to become the goal in and of itself. That's a very important distinction because healthy businesses, not just MSPs, but any business, any healthy business tends to be profitable because they are doing certain things in a certain way. It's not because they just charged enough money in order to be profitable. They made more income revenue relative to the expenses, and therefore they are profitable. Most healthy businesses, in fact, I would probably say all healthy businesses, are profitable because they do certain things. They document a process that they have. They have a process. If they have a process, it is documented. They standardize service delivery. They have a very good, tight internal set of security controls for their company, whatever their company may do, but especially true for MSPs. And they manage risk, not just financial risk, not just technical risk, but all types of business risk that could be computed in a variety of different ways. It could be analyzed in a variety of different ways, but they handle risk across the board well. The MSP channel today, though, kind of has turned that whole notion upside down on its head. And so now you have MSPs and people who profess to be MSP experts and gurus and, all manner of opinionated people. And God knows there's a lot of them out there. I have tons of opinions myself. The conversation today, though, is really focused on something different. And there's more and more questions around, well, how do I increase my margin without really changing anything else? Right? How do I increase my margin without incurring more cost that's going to mess with my bottom line? How do I cut costs without really cutting security? How do I optimize my EBITDA in a way that it isn't going to mess with other aspects of our service delivery, and so on and so on? The realization, though, I think, is you can be profitable as an MSP and you can still be dangerously immature. True just for MSPs. I think there are many other businesses and business models out there where this is a true statement. You can be profitable and still be relatively unorganized. And disorganization is the least of the problems for MSPs. It is a question of cyber hygienics, and cyber hygiene really boils down to today one of the chief areas of interest, legitimate interest by government regulators, public policy people, people who pass laws, court systems like judges and juries who are asking increasing questions related to MSP maturity levels. Cyber insurance underwriters ask this question every single day. Every single day. And it doesn't start with, hey, are you profitable? It starts with, what are your cyber hygiene practices? What are your internal risk practices? What are your documented processes? And do you follow them? And so forth and so on. Again, it doesn't mean that profitability doesn't matter, but it does mean that you ought to focus on maturity metrics first before you start paying attention to or really worrying about messing around with margin and profitability status. You will get there. If you're doing the other things well, you will get to the profitability metric that you want, and you will be able to fine tune and run your business and keep a keen eye on your financial KPIs. And you will also have the other maturity aspects well covered. So again, you can be profitable as an MSP and still be very dangerously immature or have poor MSP maturity metrics that you exhibit. And that's really what we've all been saying for 20 plus years in managed services is you can't look at a balance sheet or a P&L for an MSP and tell anything other than, a financial story of what they're doing. But it tells next to nothing about how they operate. And it says, look at any cyber control framework on the planet. I've said this many times. I'll keep saying it until people figure it out. Take a look at any cyber framework around the planet. It all focuses on not financial metrics, not financial MSP profitability, but it focuses entirely, almost exclusively, some would say, on cyber hygiene, MSP maturity. The UCS, the Cyber Verified, really focuses a blend on financial metrics and financial health, but also combining all the key elements of cyber hygiene controls that an MSP ought to be following. But profitability is not going to say anything. It's not going to tell a customer anything about you backing up your internal data. It's not going to say anything about whether you protect your administrator accounts. It's not going to say anything about whether your technicians, on your help desk, for example, are following repeatable, documented best practices that are written down someplace and tested. It's not going to speak at all to your cyber resilience or your ability to withstand a cyber attack and get back up on your feet as quickly as possible and become operational. If not for yourself, then certainly for all of your managed services customers that rely on you every single day and can't really afford for you to be out of business for any appreciable amount of time. Profitability doesn't speak to any of that. And yet we treat profit as if it is the ultimate proof of competence. It is almost held to a higher standard in today than MSP maturity is. And I think that that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake that needs to be corrected fast, which brings up to my next point of kind of where this all came about. I think peer groups had and still do today have a great amount of pressure that they place on MSPs when it comes to financial profitability and financial KPIs. And I am not saying that financial KPIs don't matter, but if they're taught and encouraged and messaged to the exclusion of other things, then that could be very destructive indeed. And so I would say I've witnessed a handful of these communities. I've heard from a lot of MSPs who have been or still part of these communities. Some of them have been part of them, but they left that community and they tell us, hey, this is what we were focused on over here. And we do a lot of financial sharing. We share our P&L every quarter and somebody analyzes it. And that tends to be like the majority of the meeting is that kind of review, that hot seat review of, what did you do for the last quarter? Oh, you became less profitable or your top line revenue dipped. Why did that dip? And, it, it puts immense pressure on MSPs to always push themselves again, not to become a better MSP, but to push a particular financial metric that is being scored and monitored and valued. That's a very different proposition. An MSP that is profitable but immature still has a ton of risk and still has a ton of exposure. And I'll explain a few of the more common areas where this is going to be manifesting itself. You could have an incident. You could have a mistake. You could have a non-mistake, just you got outgunned, outmuscled by somebody who had more technology, more time, and more investment in breaching your perimeter than you had to defending it. You're one lawsuit away. You're one insurance claim denial away, or one regulator asking a question that you can't answer. You're one question away from some really bad outcomes today as an MSP, of which none of those, financial profitability is not going to save you from any of those types of questions. Those questions are entirely maturity-based lines of questions. And again, I'm not saying that they don't have anything of relevance to your profitability status. To the contrary, I'm saying that all of those issues directly impact your financial profitability. But those companies that exhibit that maturity level didn't start with a end goal of becoming profitable and just blindly trying to figure out how to get there. They started from a position of operational maturity and best practice, and then started to fine tune their business operations models in order to achieve the appropriate financial outcomes that they were looking for. Very, very big difference. Private equity. I think it would be, and we've heard a ton of feedback from MSPs who are following this out in the wild, as they say. MSPs who talk a lot about the impact of private equity, not just in the tools, right, sold to MSPs, but in the MSP market itself. I don't think it's really possible to have that much money put into the MSP profession over a 10 plus year period and not have some very real changes come about. And I'm not saying that there haven't been some really good positive changes and outcomes. I think we've seen an entire generation has been helped to transition, right? To retire early. You've seen some people who've been in the industry for decades who said, "Hey, I don't have anybody to leave it to. I want to sell. I want to retire. I want to go do something else." And private equity has enabled a lot of those opportunities. And so I think that that's a really good story. But you can't deny that outside money, investor money being injected into not just one MSP, but an entire sector, an entire profession of MSPs. They're going to come with strings attached. They're going to come with expectations of what they want to see those MSPs do. And I tell you, very, very few of them have board members, have equity partner investor boards or investors in general who care about MSP operational maturity. They probably all care about one thing. When am I going to get my money, and am I going to get my promised return on investment? Fair question as an investor. The whole world, the rest of the world, is asking a very different question, a very different set of questions. Private equity investor money, right? It doesn't have to just be private equity. It could be any outside investor in an MSP practice. PE money doesn't invest in MSPs because they want to see, patch management at work. They don't want to do that because they like reading security documentation policies or security risk assessments for an MSP practice. A private equity investor invests because they want predictable cash flow, which is what MSPs do quite well. They have scalable revenue. Again, not unique just to MSPs, but MSPs are very well known for this attribute as well. And they have generally, especially in the last decade, they have seen and maintained very high multiples of valuation. We are in a very good position as a profession. I'm not complaining about that at all. I don't think the private equity community is complaining. In fact, quite the opposite. They're so enamored with MSPs that they keep throwing money at this profession like there's no tomorrow. And I, quite frankly, I'm happy about that. I think that's a sign of legitimacy. But it doesn't mean that it can't be a different story. It doesn't mean that you just focus only on the financial health. I think that that's going to be a lesson hard learned in the coming years for those that don't pay attention soon. The private equity logic become a dominant narrative in the MSP channel so that everything else by necessity has become deprioritized almost. When you go to conferences and all you hear are on the panels, you hear private equity investors saying, "Sell to me, I'm going to buy you out." That is a very powerful message. And when that's what you hear, I could see why you would start to think and start to run your MSP business, not according to MSP maturity models, but according to financial outcomes to get a specific number in order to achieve a specific multiple in your valuation. Tempting. You could see why. You could see why that would be very tempting. But here, I'm not indicting that. I'm not condemning that. I'm just simply stating a fact of what I believe is a fact, and I'm stating a reality as an explanation for why I think we're seeing this fixation on financial KPIs and profitability. When you have kind of this dominant profitability metric focus, a lot of everything else that is important becomes less important. Security isn't just a best practice. Security then becomes a cost center. Compliance is a delay for doing other important things in your MSP business. Maturity becomes a technical debt, a cost to doing business and a burden on the MSP practice. And here's where I'm really, really hoping that this is not already seeping into the younger generation of MSP business owners. But I would hate to think that younger MSP business owners start to believe what they're seeing and hearing at the trade shows and conventions, and they start to believe that looking good on paper is actually what matters more than being structurally sound and operationally mature MSP. I would really hate for that to be the case. I'd like to think that that isn't happening, but I think I'm also wise enough and been around the block once or twice to realize that that's probably hooked a number of people already, young and old, not just the young. So what should we be asking instead? Good question, a fair question. Let me propose a different set of questions that will all lead towards enhanced optimal MSP profitability and other beneficial financial metrics. Are you operationally sound? Are you operationally mature? Are you consistent in your services? Can you repeat them over and over and over again in the same way with very little deviation and maintaining high quality? Are you internally secure? Are you internally resilient? Can you withstand getting hit by a cyber attack? Can you get back up on your feet relatively quickly? Are your services, are your managed IT services defensible and repeatable? And I thought about this last question a lot because I've actually been seeing it and been part of this question being asked, particularly in legal proceedings. Could you explain your managed services delivery model under oath and know that what you just explained is actually how you do it, not just how you want it to be, but how it actually is delivered? I would wager a good number of MSP CEOs have one set of an understanding of how their MSP works, and the service delivery people probably would tell a very different story. I certainly think that that's very true in the reactive side of the market. In fact, I know it's true because I've seen it. I see it every day. But you see, with those questions, I'm not asking about profitability. I'm assuming that if the answer to those questions that I asked just now is yes, you're more than likely going to be a profitable MSP. How do I know that? I know that because I've been doing this for 26 years and I know enough about how MSPs operate to know that the answer in the positive to these types of questions related to MSP maturity, MSP internal cyber hygiene, MSP resilience, all mean that if you're doing these things to answer those questions in the affirmative, you are doing things that we value as good in managed services. And it means that you at least have a more than a fighting chance at being a profitable MSP. Yeah, I suppose that there's a possibility that you could be a very operationally mature MSP. You're internally secure and you're operationally, internally resilient and all that, and still be in the red. Yeah, I don't disagree that that could be a reality, but it's not going to be the norm. And it certainly isn't going to be something that you see very long term in an MSP operating at that high efficiency, high operational maturity level. That's what I'm saying. Managed services is a profession. It's a professional discipline. It is not a financial trick. And if the MSP channel continues to kind of elevate profit over responsibility, I think we're going to see in the future, in the near future, a lot more failures. You're going to certainly see a lot more lawsuits, and we're already seeing a regulation. So that's already here. We don't have to wait for that. That's already come. And we're going to start to see external controls imposed on the MSPs. If you want some kind of a final bit of evidence on what I'm saying is true, look at all the control frameworks that are being passed in the just last several years, let's say last 5 years. They're not all being passed just to focus on how do we make MSPs more profitable. That's not their concern. They're assuming you're making money hand over fist and you know how to do your job well. They want to see proof that you know how to do your job well. That's what these control frameworks are all about. That's what these cyber hygiene, cyber safe harbor laws that are being passed almost every month, that's what these are all trying to get at. And again, I am not saying profitability in the MSP market does not matter. What I'm saying is start paying a little bit more attention, start paying a lot more attention on MSP maturity, and the MSP profitability will sort itself out later. And not too much later. I'm meaning it'll have a very, very proximate result. If you're struggling with your profitability, maybe start to look at your operational maturity as a problem and fix those elements first. And you might be surprised how fast your bottom line starts to creep up. And you might be surprised at how fast your top line revenue also begins to increase. That's my take. I hope I didn't offend anybody, but hey, you know what? If you were offended, I didn't mean it. I want all MSPs to do well, to be profitable, to be safe. If you have questions, comments, send an email, send a comment. We'd love to hear from you. If there's an alternative take, if I missed something, still love to hear from you. I learn stuff every day from people who listen to the podcast and give me their take on things, and I love that. Thanks for listening. Be safe. Get certified. See you next time.